we go. Sorry. I'd like to call to order the September 22nd, 2016 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission and ask our sole guest to make sure that he's silenced his electronic device, and everybody up here too. Heather, would you please call the roll?
Tom Grinstead?
Here.
Garrett O'Brien?
Here.
Ellie Teishi?
Here.
Steve Crooks?
Here.
Lisa Anderson? Here. And Jeff Brown and Phyllis McKee are excused.
Thank you. Okay, so we have no minutes to approve. We've only had one meeting in the past several months. And we can move right into the public comment period, which is for discussion of items that are not on tonight's agenda, which is the Land Use Code Amendment running list, we'll call it. Yeah, introduction. So ask the sole member of the audience, are you interested in making a public comment on any other topic? Okay, he's shaking his head no. So with that, we'll forego the public comment period. And I think we can just move right into it. Sure. And so, Rick, do you want to just kind of take it away and introduce it? And
members of the commission, good evening. I'm joined by Kurt Naberfeld, our Planning Division Manager for Development Services. And we're here today to introduce to you some of the items on the running list. Let's step back and say, what is the running list? From time to time during the course of a year, either council, staff, or the mayor's office identify minor fixes or major changes that need to be addressed in the municipal code. It's highly inefficient to stop everything when they're raised and try to start processes. As Planning Commission is aware, we have to do notice, we have to do environmental review, have to do at least 2 public hearings. Often we want to involve the community meaningfully in it. And some of those may or may not be appropriate as an omnibus where you sort of do quick fixes. However, we do have a need to address some aspects of the code, mostly technical, and we're going to introduce 4 of the 5 items that are on the running list to you for consideration tonight. Our hope would be is after discussion tonight, we would come back with a suggested amendment. We're hoping to make it a fairly functional, corrective amendment as opposed to a broader process. Broader processes will need to wait until we have resources available when the subdivision code and ADU ordinance are done. That'll be the next thing online. So I'm going to kind of work our way through them, and I'll introduce them more broadly, and then we'll talk about it. The hope would be at the end of the evening, if you feel there's merit, we would assemble several of these, 1 or more, or none, if you think all would merit greater scrutiny. We would then do our notice and environmental review and bring it forward for public hearing at a future meeting. I think you could see, for example, the fences on transitional zoning, probably not that controversial, but represents an error we discovered in the code that could have an adverse effect. Some others might have broader implications, and hence we sort them out with you in discussion. That being said, if I could walk our way through it, we'll try to frame the issues, and I will ask Kurt to chime in too, to talk about it. And I think maybe if we just introduce them all and talk about the purpose, then we can come back and take them one by one, answer your questions and discussion, and seek some direction on it.
Thank you.
So the first one is the one I used as a good example. About a year ago, we discovered that in our transitional zoning, although we require screening, the material of choice tends to be chain link fences. A chain link fence at the rear of residential lot may not be the kindest transition from transitional uses to single-family residential. It was suggested in those cases a wood fence would be more appropriate in keeping with the character of the area. And as such, we would suggest one revision would be to add language. We provided a draft for you that would allow that to go forward. We do have latitude for choices too, because in some circumstances, arguably one could say a chain link fence is very appropriate. Grade separation or other issues that come up, and I think we have the ability to approve that in those unique circumstances. The second is one that deals with unclassified uses in commercial and industrial zones. In most zoning codes, there's provision to say in an industrial use area, you have a use table. If the use is not listed in pure zoning, it's not permitted. However, because there are so many unique uses that we would all pretty much agree have the same industrial impact or say impact of other uses that are allowed in the area, This provides a process that would be by right in industrial uses after determination, but conditional in commercial areas, and it would only apply to commercial or industrial. And the reason conditional is sometimes it's hard to say what would fit if it wasn't listed and predictable. We want to give the opportunity. As you know from looking at the uses allowed in industrial areas, they're pretty broad, provided they're industrial. We do have a need to do this in that we believe that a shelter for the homeless will likely be sited in the future in an industrially zoned area. If you look at the zoning table, you see we allow for a number of similar facilities, from everything from offenders and release to other circumstances. Very similar in impact. Wouldn't be one that would displace, we don't anticipate more than one not-for-profit shelter. And that's a good example. Additionally, over the course of the last couple of years, we have had some inquiries that are unique blends of uses. Short of going to try to rezone the code, if we could say that industrial use that's proposed is roughly proportional, and that's the finding we have to make with an allowed use, we should probably allow it. And if we don't allow it, we should say where it could go in the district itself. So that is a proposal to address that issue. The third issue is the clarification of the boarding house definition, and that is referred to you from the City Council. The City Council directed us to take a look at it, and we've included the materials prepared from Mr. Lilliquist. Mr. Lilliquist believes that there's a simple fix that could address the boarding house number. So there was a ceiling to it. To be fair, staff believes it's a little more complex than that and might warrant greater scrutiny than what a running list kind of quick fix could do, but may have merit for discussion. We're interested in your opinion. And finally, concerns have been raised regarding the size of some of the projecting signage in Fairhaven. Specifically, 2 new signs and one that's proposed for restaurants are fairly large. And the concern that was voiced to us was whether it was disproportionate to the size of the building and inconsistent with the character of the district. Since that kind of fix is really more of a square footage issue, where you bring in simulations saying what seems to be about right, we thought it could be something we might be able to handle if you think there's merit to that issue in the running list. So that's sort of a very quick touch on the ones that are there. The remaining issue deals with scale, bulk and scale in historic districts. That's going to take a full public process to do that one. It's not something we could do fast, in a sense. You want to get feedback, you want to talk about character, you want to get people involved in doing so. And bulk and scale has significant financial implications to potential property owners. We want to be very mindful of having a project. I kind of see that one perhaps coming out after subdivision, which is, as you know from the schedule, is coming forward to you next month, and after our ADU update, which at this point seems to be fairly much an update rather than any wholesale changes. So we'd be happy to answer questions on these, or we could just kind of walk through them and tell you more about what we know. Is there anything you'd like to add to?
No, I think you've done it all, and we can get into specifics if need be. So.
Does anybody have any general question?
Yeah,
Lisa?
just to help me keep the right frame of mind going here, when it comes to the boarding house, if we did move forward, Councilmember Lilliquist's recommendation on limiting the size or the bedroom count, would that mean that that would eliminate being able to move it forward in the near future to address it in a more in-depth view?
It would, there are several ways you could proceed on this. Councilmember Lilliquist suggested that there was a gap in our code and an interim solution could be a better way of proceeding. You put a placeholder in, and the way you do it, you declare an emergency, you put a placeholder in, it becomes the law for a period of time, but then you must initiate the work virtually immediately to solve it on a long-term basis. Since you can do an interim control without any public input, You can just basically call a legal meeting and do it. And then the only one who could do that is the council. They have the power to do that. You have to have a public hearing within 30 days, and then you have to have a full process to remedy it. I guess at this point, the matter before you is twofold. First, do you think it's of such significance that you would recommend that perhaps an interim control be established? That's certainly one. The second is you could suggest we think we can solve it very simply. It's not as complex as some might suggest and consider it. Our concern as staff is we think it is much more complex because it involves a variety of uses, and it's one where we do think it's probably likely we tackle it, but we probably differ in the sense of an emergency that would require us to sort of drop what we're doing to pick that one up. But that's just our opinion. I think that's, we'd like to get to it. We'd put it on the list. We intend to get to it within the next year. But we don't feel it's so emergent and so pressing, we'd stop.
Steve, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I had a question about how the running list is put together. Reading the first paragraph on background, you say it comes from obviously different directions, staff, community members, planning commission.
Yes.
Over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, I have continually made mention of signage problems in the city of Bellingham, not necessarily just Fairhaven. How do I get that on the running list, or is there a bigger field that should be involved with?
Well, let me address that on point. The running list is associated with code changes. Enforcement is not specifically a code change.
Right.
That's a policy.
Right.
So it wouldn't be germane for it. However, if this body, in reviewing municipal codes, you're looking at some issue, you come across something that doesn't make sense, you have the ability by majority vote to put something on the running list. And, again, our intent on this one is, can we get the low-hanging fruit, move them through fairly quickly because we have the chance to advance it, and then take the time that's warranted for more complex issues.
Well, I feel very strongly about what's happening with flags, with banners, with balloons, with people standing on the street waving signs. And I think it really we're getting to the point where it should be addressed, and it's not covered or there is no enforcement. I've gone in through the code. Building signage should be based on square footage. There's banners hanging under signs on buildings. I've taken pictures and gone to city council with it, and nothing ever happened. So my question is, how can I get this subject to move forward?
Well, there are a number of council members who share your concern. It is on our work program. We're going to try to get to it. The challenge on signage is there is a case that went through the U.S. Supreme Court, and it affects commercial signage. And I just returned from the Planning Directors Conference. All of us are trying to figure out how to implement it right now. So rather than us being the first in the state to do a compliant sign code, we're hoping some of the bigger jurisdictions will tackle it. It is likely when that's done, we'll have to address it. More specifically on enforcement is a priority-driven issue. I will say that the hardest codes to enforce are sign codes. They're very, very difficult, not so much because it's not clear on how to enforce them, but they have no shortage of strong emotion associated with them. A number of businesses will argue that their sandwich board is all that separates them between failure. Others will say that, if you touch my signs, if you take my flags away, my business will fail. It creates great friction. I would say that my experience, because I've gone through communities and we've done the sign cleanup, we've done the notice, we've gotten rid of all the illegal signs. I should say, not to be flippant, but it takes a crew of 3, one to drive the truck, one to take the signs, and the last one to hold back the property owners who are coming out trying to get their signs back. It is very, very contentious, but it can be done, and then you maintain it. If we do this, my advice to council is we need to be all in, meaning we have to go and we have to be consistent and stay the course and enforce the code. We're willing to do that, but we need to be strategic on when that should come up. I would argue that, from my perspective, There are a couple of issues that take precedence over the code right now, and we're working on them. That's finishing the comp plan. We must do that. And then the second is the annexation phasing plan and level of service, because those deal with the financial ability for the city to provide services into the future. My hope had been, and we said this to council, is once we get through that annexation plan, that would be one of the first things we tackle as a major issue if council wishes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I think we should go through them,
Sure.
like one by one, and that'll keep us more focused. And then, of course, Tom?
Yeah, I have a question on, I've been on council for a while now. I don't, 7 years, maybe 6, I don't remember. And this is the first time I've seen a running list come up. How how often do you anticipate the commission and city council to face this running list? Is it going to be once a year, twice a year?
It's typically once to twice a year. The reason you haven't seen it before is it's something I brought with me from another jurisdiction. It's a way to memorialize things we identify when we're working or we come across, not forget them. And then you try to assemble the ones that are easy, for example, on this pass, and be able to find a process for the ones that are harder down the road so they fit in your work program. We just don't want to lose them. I would say in other jurisdictions they become several pages. Our goal is always to keep them to a single page. In this case, we looked through and said, boy, this is the first time we're doing it. We've got a couple of ones we think are relatively easy. When we do a code amendment, every code amendment, if we did it separately, has a lot of extra work. You have to do a SEPA checklist for every one of them. You have to do a threshold determination. You have to do notice. You have to send it to CTED. If you can compile some easier ones together once a year, and then take the harder ones and put them in your work program, we can tick them off and they wouldn't be done. So that's the purpose. And council approved it.
Okay.
They thought it was a good idea to
Yeah,
memorialize
I
it.
just had never seen it, and I just wanted to understand where is it coming from and how often?
That's a good question.
It is a good question.
All right. So should we just go down the list?
Please.
Yeah, fencing first. And I mean, you gave us a pretty good explanation. I don't know if we want to just go straight to kind of discussion, unless you feel like there's more detail you want to give us up front.
We have some suggested language,
Yeah.
and we've included it. So we tried to frame the issue in the sheet, and under double underline would be the new language that would be proposed for the code to provide the clarification. And again, this doesn't replace, we'd notice this, we'd have a public hearing, all those things. This is just to say, should we move forward with it, or is it too complex for this low-hanging fruit approach?
Steve?
Yeah, I would hate to say that, you know, cyclone fencing is out, and you gave a good explanation. It's not, hopefully, not going to be completely out. There are circumstances that are going to have to say we need the cyclone fencing. Wood, in a very dark, secure, dark area between some of these areas, just going to invite graffiti, and it's going to be a bigger problem. And I really support this. I think there are areas that wood fencing would look fantastic. I just don't want to say no cyclone fencing. I think that's important.
Lisa?
I'll agree with that. The last line under the amend Chapter 5B, where it says chain link fencing shall specifically not be allowed between commercial and residential areas, I'd like to have that not be so finite that it's not allowed, because there will be appropriate situations where maybe not the entire barrier, but maybe an area that's a cut through or a stub, you know, between the parking lot and then to the fence. And I think when you're looking between two developments, having something completely eliminated does eliminate some of the opportunities where you do want to be able to have that ability to visually look through, especially in parking areas and stuff for security, also graffiti aspect. And it's not addressed here, and it may not be a good place to address it, but the concern about wood fencing is that it doesn't have as long of a shelf life. and that there's really, like, whose responsibility is it for maintenance would be a concern.
Would it be fair to say if we said that wood fencing would be preferable unless there are issues associated with security or other measures that could be demonstrated? Something like that would be, that gives a safety valve, but they'd have to demonstrate those issues.
I think putting the onus on them demonstrating why a chain link fence would be more preferable, and then also if it's at all possible that, you know, both parties are in agreement. Because if I was a single-family neighborhood, I may want that solid fence, and maybe a developer doesn't want to put it in. So I think it could, if there's something that, if there's a preference, that preference will hold more weight for what gets implemented.
I have a question. It starts out by talking about the general commercial zone, but then the proposed language is for urban villages. And so I just want to understand I guess I don't understand fully where we're adding this. Is this, Kurt, can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, you betcha. Well, one of the issues that we've seen mostly with our urban villages is these transitional zones between the commercial and the residential. In
Yeah.
those areas specifically where you've got these developments that are right on the property, we've seen some instances that chain link was used, and it probably wasn't the best place in between that transition between the two uses. And we felt that the language didn't allow us the authority to say no to it, and we were really looking for that because we believe that it's generally not preferable to have some sort of harsh chain link fence between a residential. I mean, if you think about it, you could have a pretty high tense commercial use, and then right next door you've got a single family home, and chain link fencing dramatically can change the character of that area. So we felt that it was pretty important to not allow these, but you raised some good issues tonight about safety and concerns, and maybe there are certain times for it. So that's where we saw the general need is in these urban villages, but we do believe that there are other areas in here, and the 2025 is the urban village zone and kind of this broader area as well.
So would this also then apply, like if you had a regular, like a planned commercial zone next to a residential zone? Would we try and get this standard everywhere? Because I mean, to me, it makes a lot of sense when you're transitioning.
Yeah, we can definitely include that in the landscaping section. All of our chapters have landscaping, and we can just add, another fencing line.
It just
for
seems
all
to me,
the
like,
areas.
like if it's an identified problem and we're going to tackle it to try and fix it, it might make sense to just do it uniformly, because kind of like this commercial zoning code update they presented, where we make it all more uniform across all the commercial zones. And then in the urban villages, you kind of pre-answered the question about how it would be implemented. In a normal zone, it would be through the landscaping section maybe, but in the urban villages, would this be like it's like a design standard basically? Just like the other ones we've got?
Yes.
So if it was an all commercial project that didn't have a design review permit requirement, you just catch it during like the building permit review or something.
We could by expanding it into that landscaping section, yes, because then no matter whether or not you don't have a design review permit or a planned permit associated with it, it's just a straight up building permit. There is that landscaping section that would capture it as well.
Yeah, because there could be just a straight commercial use in a CT zone
Right.
that doesn't have a land use permit.
Correct.
So, I mean, just thinking about, I like the idea, so thinking about applying uniformly, but I do agree that, there may be certain use types where it makes sense for safety to have visibility. Garrett?
Well, tonight we're just recommending whether or not this be worked on further, right? I mean, this is not specific language but we're just providing direction to you.
Yeah.
Because I think with fencing, there is a concern anytime that you have a transition of uses. I really hesitate to say, that wood fencing is a priority or would be better, because it is a maintenance issue. And a wood fence could look great for, 5 years, and then if it's not maintained, it starts to rot and decay, and the posts go. I think it's more important to try to draft language that emphasizes quality and privacy versus a specific style of fence. And one thing, when we reviewed that commercial zoning update or ordinance update that I thought was really helpful is when they had illustrations. And even if it's photographs of some, I guess, ideal applications where people look at that and say, okay, this is the intent, is that it provides a visual screen, a transition, it's high quality, it's durable. Because there's all different host of, fencing, vinyl
Yeah.
fencing. You could do, composite. So I just think, I think the intent here is really good, and I think we should just think through it a little bit and start looking for some, examples that we can provide, and then really that the intent's about quality and screening and basically being a good neighbor.
Anything? I get the impression that I think everybody thinks this is a good one to keep on the list. I mean, you're right, Garrett. We're not here to get too far into the weeds, but
So
I-
what,
yeah,
what
do,
we're-
you, do, you, do you need some like formal?
No. This is just,
Yeah,
what
just
we're saying
discussion.
is, what I'm hearing you say is that if we spend a little time to flesh out this and look for other opportunities, it's probably that low-hanging fruit
Yeah.
kind of thing. We should bring it forward.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem controversial. We kind of work it out to make it happen. Let's fix the code so it's better.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll consider that as the first one we'd likely
Yeah.
bring forward.
And just to, I know you said this earlier in the introduction, but just to clarify the process, assuming 3, 4, however many of these get put together, the intent then would be to bring it to the public for a public hearing. Once you
absolutely.
have the details.
Yes.
And then so we go, so now here's the ideas and here's the implementation we've developed. Let the public have an opportunity to comment on it. And then it goes through the regular legislative process.
We would develop this further. We would provide
Yeah.
notice. We'd have
Okay.
drafts out there. We'd bundle it all together, so there'd be
Yeah.
several different things in the ordinance. We'd make it clear in the staff report what they were.
Yeah.
But you consider them all under one public hearing.
Okay, thank you. So the second item was unclassified uses. And did everybody understand the presentation on that and any specific questions? Steve?
Yeah, process question. Considering that you want to put this on a running list, my initial concern is why wouldn't this be a type 6 review going forward?
In industrial and then perhaps conditionally in commercial areas, that's a whole year. And there are opportunities that are lost. Where we have a use that on the face of it, you look at it and go, well, yeah, that's just like this other use, it's just not stated explicitly. So you can't go and use this process to take something that's dissimilar.
Well, Mike, you mentioned homeless, perhaps a homeless project in one of these.
Yeah, that would be a good example.
So my concern is, but I'm hearing something different. I'm thinking that a type 6 would bring in a public a review, open dialogue between the public, because as I read this, I said, well, the director can just make a decision and that's it. I was concerned that the public is not going to be brought in to say a decision because it was on a running list.
The running list just lets us bring it before you for consideration. This would if you said yes, we would have to have a hearing on it. The public can weigh in on it. The intent here is not to provide subjective authority. It's solely to say that if we can demonstrate it's similar in impacts or the same as impacts or even less in impacts than a use that's allowed, and of that type, could we not do it? The thing with the type 6 is certainly it's a reasonable way to do it, but it is a disincentive in a lot of the industrial type uses. Because you have to wait a whole year to get on the docket, to go the thing through, and isn't that the...
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would like to add on this is that we run into these situations actually quite often where we've got a list in our zoning that lists out specific uses, but we get a new use that comes in and we go, well, it's not really this one, it's not really that one. What do we do here? And so what we've done in the past is we've tried to do essentially what we're doing here is look at, well, it has the same characteristics as this type of use and the same characteristics of this type of use. So it's pretty similar in nature in impact and use. The problem is that we just don't have a formalized process in order and criteria to evaluate that. And so we believe that this actually will be very beneficial to staff as well as the general public, because when you do come up with that type of use that you don't really know it's not listed, it's not one of the ones that's listed in the table, that this will help us go through the analysis of what types of impacts are associated with the use and whether or not it should be allowed in these zonings, or whether it should be conditional in other zonings. So,
And to be fair, we don't think this approach is appropriate in residential, multifamily, urban villages. Those are all different things, because I do think it does merit that discussion. We really signed a deal with our residents on what uses are allowed. But industrial and some commercial, it's a different animal in a way. We have a better list and criteria to work from.
Anything that could streamline the process and relieve staff of some work, and we get things done quicker, I would definitely support. And if the public has a chance to input. So I would certainly be for moving this forward.
This would not trump shorelines, for example, in the notice process or any other permitting that's discretionary, SEPA, all of those. This would just allow us to do something we're doing now, at least have a formal method.
Is there a mechanism where neighboring businesses would be informed that a decision was being made by the planning director to allow a use to come in that was not necessarily listed, so that if they did not agree with it, they would have an opportunity to comment on it?
They certainly could have commented, and certainly it's also appealable. This is an administrative process of type 1. Typically does not require notice going out. But good practice is, if you're going to be a neighbor, you discuss it with the surrounding folks. We encourage that.
And if you guys the way this reads, if you determined it was like a conditional use,
It would be-
then we would have
Yeah.
the applicant would have to go through a conditional use permit process, which, so I mean, if it was
It would be noticed. Yeah.
borderline.
Yeah, I think this is great. I mean, we need to maintain flexibility, and this is just identifying uses and seeing what if it meets the spirit of an industrial use or commercial use, and we can't have a little box for everything. So
Yeah.
I think it's really good to have flexibility, and then have a process that transcends one administration to another that people can go back and use and say this is our checklist. So that's great.
In the industrials, I've had this come up a few times professionally, and I've gone to Kurt and said, "What is this use?" And they've done exactly what he just described. So it does happen, particularly in industrial, sometimes in commercial. So before I came down tonight, I was looking at the code real quick, because I thought that there was already something there. And in the industrial zone, there's a use. One of the permitted uses currently is uses similar to those permitted. So my question is, we already have? Is that already? Are we trying to make it more clear what the rules are for those? Because it felt like we already have this option.
We have that. We can do it. We've done it in the past. We're just trying to give criteria of why
Yeah.
we're doing it. So if there was an appeal, and you go in front of an examiner and they said, "Why did you do that?" Well, number one, would it be the same? Here's how we found. Number two, it's consistent with the comp plan. Comp plan says these kind of uses should go there. Number three, it's the same intensity, number of trips for cars, number of noise, all those things. It's much more sustainable, and to be honest, it provides comfort to us that we have a basis for making the decision rather than just making the decision.
Yeah, I agree. Right now, I feel like we can ask, and you just kind of get to go, "Hey, yeah, we think it works," and that's usually fine for the applicant if you agree. But this seems like actually a more defensible process, more transparent, where you would say, like you just said, Rick, like these are the reasons why we thought that was, and it also could then establish some precedent so that it's easier in the future when like uses come forward. One guy wants to do something that's unique, and you go through the process to determine it's okay. The next time, that new staff person can go, "Oh, well, we already looked at this," and there's that record, instead of like an email that might, go between a few people. So I agree with Garrett. I think it's a good idea for that reason.
Yeah, a good example on this in other jurisdictions, microbreweries came forward, the production facilities. They weren't allowed in industrial areas because no one had thought to put microbreweries into the list of uses. But if you look at it and you say trucks coming and going, materials being done there, all these things similar in impacts, we could make a finding. The next thing that's like that would be similar.
Any opposition to keeping that on the list? It seems like we also agree that that's something that could.
So in a sense, you're directing us to take it off the list and bring it forward as an
Yes,
ordinance.
yeah.
Okay, that's a good one.
Exactly. So now the most interesting one, I'm sure, will generate the most discussion, boarding and rooming houses definitions. Is there anything more you kind of want to provide on this one? I know this came forward, you said it came forward from council. It looks like this was kind of based on some historical correspondence from Councilmember Lilliquist and
I see, I think he, to be fair, I think he's identified an area where we have a lot of definitions sort of put together, and they probably need to be separated and sussed out. And I would professionally say I don't disagree with that. I just don't think it, I think it's one that's going to take some time, because you have to look at each one of them and sort of say, what do we get? And where is it appropriate, and how does that work? I don't know, where we might differ is the sense of emergency. To declare an interim control and stop other things to bring that forward and work on it now. It doesn't seem like we have that pressing issue at this point. Nonetheless, I do think leaving it, our recommendation would be leave it on the list. We should get to it when time becomes available. It is an issue that has importance. But I'd be interested in your opinion. If you think we may be wrong, you may think this is a fine solution, in which case we should talk more.
go ahead.
It's interesting. I don't know if you had a chance to read Jeff Brown's email today. He had some very good points in there. All I can say, I think this is an extensive issue. I think it needs more definition. I think it needs to be clarified and brought back at some later time. But I fully support moving this forward.
As a part of this consolidated process, or as its own kind of unique, larger topic?
I think the process will determine how it's going to be handled. If this is such a complex issue, then at some point in time, we're going to have to introduce it as a singular event to us and to City Council. But I think this process of the intent of moving this forward should go forward, discovering more or initial problems that come up with the definitions and
Continue to work on it.
yeah, yes.
Lisa?
I've kind of struggled with this one because I think Councilmember Lilliquist made some really good points, and taking a look at the date of one of the letters being June 2nd, 2015, I think that's, it's been a concern brought forward for a period of time. Part of me wants to bring this forward so that at least we can maybe help define the boundaries of a boarding house as far as how many rooms, so that we don't end up with someone coming forward with a very large complex of 5 rooms with a common living area, and we're looking at 400 units or something, and they're putting it under the guise of being a boarding house. Not to say there's something in the works like that, but I would like to have limits of what a boarding house is defined. I do think it is a much larger topic than to just be combined in one meeting with some low-hanging fruit. But if this is something that's not, if it's going to be kicked down the road because of resources for another 1 to 5 years, I think we need to have some baseline definition of size and scope come forward, with it coming back to really address some of the larger issues. So I guess I would be okay taking it off the table so that we could have a, because I'm afraid that if it's just the one little part, it's going to bring out everybody in the neighborhoods and developers coming forward and really kind of monopolize what should be a cleanup process for helping better the plan. If this was going to come forward in the next year, where, once subdivision was done and ADUs and a couple of the other projects that are coming forward, if this could get on that list and be a little bit more timely, I'd be fine taking it out, because knowing that there's going to be an end life to this where it can be brought forward to a full process would be beneficial. I just don't want 2-3 years from now, more letters written and that this is back in this small little project and not really fully being addressed. So I guess that goes to you, is when do you foresee the opportunity for the boarding house to come forward in more of a full measure for public process for input?
Well, again, a couple of things. First thing we do, there's a status at the end of the table, and we put in the notes of your discussion tonight, so we wouldn't lose that. Brought forward on this date. Planning Commission suggests that it come forward, within a year. We know of no project that's taking advantage of this at this point. I'm not aware of any. So it's nothing pre-apt or something in the wings or coming, which is why we have a little less sense of urgency. That being said, we can note it for a year. I would think we might have a discussion perhaps at another date as we near to the end of subdivision about what is more pressing from your opinion in terms of bulk and scale or that issue, because I think equal amounts of rigor needs to be brought to them, and perhaps we'll advance which one after that you think is more appropriate and timely. Happy to do it that way. Does that sound reasonable? So we have subdivision coming to you for workshop next month and for hearing most likely before the end of the year. ADU will likely be coming to you, and at this point it's not wholesale change, it's just minor cleanup and perhaps a pilot program in one area of town that's interested in pursuing. We'll see if they still are. Those two things they'll be coming in January or so. So I would imagine by mid-year we're ready to tackle one or the other.
Garrett?
Well, I just had a question. So looking at the list that we're putting together and the recommendations that we're making, I mean, a lot of these seem fairly simple. I mean, to draft up language, I mean, it seems like good maintenance to do to code amendments. This other one, and that's why I just want to figure out, are we trying to recommend the boarding house issue to be included with this? I mean, to me, it seems like it should be separate. It should be its own. There's a lot more going on than just a simple code cleanup, in my opinion.
I think that's what Steve and Lisa suggested.
Okay.
Too.
Okay.
So,
I think
not to speak for you, but that's kind of the impression I got. But that it's important enough to be.
It warrants
looked at.
being looked at. I wouldn't recommend to include it in our this short list of what I see as kind of maintenance items.
Yeah.
To clarify my thoughts, I would like to see the bulk and scale and this come forward. And I know it's all about resources, so I try to be respectful of that. It's kind of like trying to cut a baby in half and decide who gets what part. It's an impossible decision because I think both are very important. Maybe not the best example to use, but my concern is if this isn't going to come forward in the next year or two to be dealt with, I would rather have something that helped define it versus nothing, because even though there may not be something pending, it's impossible to predict what's going to come across your desk in a month or 5 months. And I just don't want a developer coming forward, we don't have a definition, and then just have everybody just go off the rails because we can't have a particular project because it's really not truly a boarding house in scope. So I think part of planning is predicting the possibility of the future and making sure we make good decisions and have things on the books that are going to help guide that. So I'm good with taking this off with the hopes that we're going to have something come forward sooner than later.
Yeah, I'm with Lisa on that. I don't think that anything is gained by kicking down the road 3 or 4 years. So if it can be brought up, in a year or 15 months, something like that, then it makes sense to take it off the table now.
If I might, I'll put it on the work program for next year, both items, because that's kind of where I had them. It's just I can't guarantee it's going to be May or June. It depends how the public process works for other issues. And you'll be working on you'll be involved in the annexation phasing plan to some degree too.
I appreciate you putting it on the list and helping elevate, keeping it somewhere in the near division.
I think that's a smart approach. I agree that I think it's going to turn out to be a bigger issue than we think. I think you're going to draw in a discussion about the definition of family, which I know is a big deal, because I know a lot of people look to do these that I've talked to are looking to get more than 3 bedrooms, and they don't feel comfortable building a 4-bedroom apartment unit because they don't want to break the rule that we've established. And I have all sorts of opinions about that definition that we can get into maybe in a year, but I think we're going to draw that in. I also think that a cap is a really interesting idea, but there's different zones that permit these things, and there might be different thresholds in a residential multi-zone adjacent to York versus, say, a commercial core zone in an urban village, where a limit of 10 could be really draconian in a sense. So I think there's going to be a lot of satellite issues that kind of suck into it, and so I also agree that it would be appropriate to take it as a separate topic. Yeah, bigger than we might think. So anyway, I think we're comfortable with that.
So what I'm hearing you say is an important issue. We've suggested it'll be on the work program in the next 12 months, plus or minus, but that timely. And we'll note that in the status on this, and we can keep checking it. This will be online, so you could all check it.
Almost like it's too important to just be thrown in with the little stuff.
You know, the advantage of doing an omnibus with little things is you could do one hearing, usually
Yeah.
non-controversial, we fix
Yeah.
our code, and then you take the time, individual items that really merit discussion.
I can imagine that you could bog down simple things unintentionally and
Well,
actually harm yourself in getting the easy stuff done if you go too far with it. So,
Sure.
Great. Okay, so the last one's the Fairhaven signage.
Are you guys familiar with the signs we're talking about? It was
No.
the signs that had come to attention were the new burger bistro. Was that
Whiskey Burger
Whiskey Burger.
and
Oh,
the
yeah.
Fat Pie.
Yeah.
Fat Pie? And there was a third that was applied for jalapenos. We followed our code, and the concern that came in from a number of sources was they're just physically big, and there is no institutional standard that really talks about the size. You know, it's more of you look at them and say, is it the right proportions? So that's the issue that comes forward.
A little additional background on that is before we adopted the Fairhaven Urban Village and Neighborhood Plan, you used to have to do a design review permit for signs. We felt that when someone wanted to come in and just add a sign, taking them through this longer design review process was too burdensome. And so in drafting the Fairhaven Urban Village Code, we tried to take our design guidelines and make them more prescriptive and actually put them in the code. What we've found is that the words that we've used just doesn't really do it. And we think that we need to tweak the words a little bit, make them a little bit more understandable, something that's more easy for not only staff but also the applicant to understand when they're designing these signs, because we've had several of the sign companies say, well, what does it mean by use the shape of the sign to reinforce the lines of the building? Well, what does that mean? How do you use the sign to reinforce lines of the building? And what lines of the building? The door lines, the roof lines, the base lines? And so I think our attempt to make this simpler by making it prescriptive somewhat backfired on us a little bit. And so we've realized now over the time that we've implemented this, we need to tweak it a little bit to make it work better for everyone.
Anybody? Sounds logical. Do you guys have any ideas? I notice this is more just like these are some questions we want to explore, but are you already starting to formulate some ideas about?
Yeah, we definitely have some thoughts. As we were looking over some of the applications and trying to really get into it and determine whether or not it met the code, we definitely brought up some ideas. So what if the code said this? That would help us out a lot more. What if it said this? So we've got some ideas that will definitely help.
I think we want to get some images and bring them in and just say, this is what works, and you get to see them too. Clearly the public would. Horizontal, if the building is rectilinear and it kind of works, you kind of see it. We don't think round elements are bad, but when they're the dominant form, they're perceived as being very large. So I guess we would, if you think it's appropriate, we would develop a definition, get some images for it, bring it forward, and say, here's why we think that might work, and clarify.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Everybody feels good about that. Just a quick follow-up. You email, or Heather emailed out the updated attachment with the bulk and mass item added, and then, you know, at the beginning of the meeting, we kind of heard that not really going to be discussed. Is there any reason why? Was that why, you know, we kind of added it to talk about, but then thought maybe not? Was it too big of an issue?
On this pass, we're looking for those quick fixes that we could bring forward,
Yeah.
that we could put into an omnibus that would go through with, you know, that on the face of it, any independent source reading it goes, these are pretty straightforward. They're just trying to clarify things, not establishing new uses or changing plans, just workmanlike stuff. We think that one is more complex because I think a lot is, it's a technical exercise, but needs to be done as part of public process. We just can't go and come back and say this is the right bulk and scale. You know, we need to come back. And the second thing is there are a lot of historic districts, and each one has unique circumstances. So we need to talk about that and how that would work. A good example of this, I did this in Port Townsend in the Uptown area. Folks, boy, if you had a Victorian in Uptown, you know, the bathrooms weren't built in the house, and the furnace usually was right in the center, and there were no closets. So it's hard to do adaptive reuse on some of those Victorians, but the character and the scale of the street was very important. So the bulk and scale for that solution was you can build to the back of your lot. You can build to the back of the house because we wouldn't see it at the street, and it could carry the mass much better, and it allowed that to work. So basically it says that's where you build when you want to build additions. That might be a good solution for some of our areas, rather than sort of the very large homes, wider, things like that.
And this is really, we're talking single-family areas here.
Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that in my own mind.
Yep. If they're a listed historic district, you
Sure.
come back and say, what's the character and scale? Folks are allowed to do additions. You know, we're not trying to dissuade that because, like I said, you need closets and
Yeah.
things like that. But it's where you do it that keep the character at the street level. And that's what you want to do the work on. And each one's different. You got to come back and say, what's the right scale? In Port Townsend, for a different part of town, it was in a different historic district, because there are three, really. It was dealing with side yard setbacks. We increased the side yard setbacks. And that drove the building to the center of the lot. Made a big difference. It provided that spacing between units. So those are all the things we'd likely be exploring, and each case is different.
Great. Thank you. Garrett?
I think it's good not to be hasty about, you know, when you're looking about establishing any kind of restrictions on potential, you know, options for property owners. And I would think for something like this, it'd be a good idea to even do a couple focus groups and try to get, you know, remodelers or people that are involved in that kind of business and neighborhood groups, or people that have a understanding of the character of the neighborhood to gather input. That we could learn about each unique district and maybe make, if there is restrictions that are appropriate, but early feedback, focus groups with would be good, I think, on that one.
Steve?
Yeah, I've got a question, deals with Fairhaven signage. If a company was to meet the new definition and put up a sign on the outside, everything's fine. How about going inside the building and making a huge neon sign in the inside of the building? Does anything cover that?
Usually, and I'll ask if you know our codes better than I, usually there's a distance setback from the window does not count. There's some measure. That's how most jurisdictions deal with interior signage. So you can make a whole sign as big as the NEC that's on the wall above you. If it's inside your building and if it's set back from the window so far, it doesn't count as a sign.
Thank
Most jurisdictions do that, but Bellingham likes to be unique, and we do not do that. So, some of our areas actually say that window sign is not counted. So it does raise concerns and issues at times.
Interesting.
Like I said, we anticipate, because of the Reed versus Gilbert Supreme Court decision, having to go through our code on commercial signage. So when we're there, if we're in, we're going to be all in, and we'll be looking at all of these issues.
Good luck.
It's extraordinarily complex
Right.
in every jurisdiction.
Lisa?
Speaking of Supreme Court, is there like a Cliff Notes summary about what that decision was that could be shared so that we don't have to read our great Supreme Court justices ramble for hundreds of pages? But it would be interesting to have it watered down just so that we know what we're looking forward to in the future.
Sure, it's an intriguing case, and the town of Gilbert, outside of Phoenix, took a church that used off-premise signs because the church moved a lot. It didn't have a permanent facility. It rented different spaces for services, and said these are off-premise signs that are not allowed. And the church appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court. And as a professional planner, as an aside, I go, why did you pick this one? I mean, it seems so silly, but they did. And the Supremes came back and weighed in and said, basically, we have limitations on how much we can restrict commercial signage. So I will send you an article from MRSC and a link to that. We'll send it out. You're smiling. You'll see who the you'll see who the author is. It's not me, unfortunately, but you'll see who the author is, and it's a good intro.
Great. Tom? No? All right. So I think that covers everything. There's no public testimony. It does not appear for this topic. So we can wrap up the what we'll call the work session portion.
Sure.
And it sounds like, Rick, you said that coming up we're going to have subdivision. We know about the next meeting, but then from there move to like a public hearing.
Yeah, I think we'll do a
Great.
workshop on subdivision. If you feel you need additional time, we'll delay the public hearing, in a sense. But since it's been through focus groups, you've been introduced to it, we think we can come before you and introduce it. And if you get the thumbs up, we would notice a public hearing and then go forward with it. And you could consider as many sessions as you need after public comment to resolve it before you recommend it on. What we'll do in this case, and just so you know the words you'll see, we'll call this an omnibus because we're going to have more than one thing, and it'll be minor code. We'll title it, if you agree, minor code adjustments, and then by title every one that we're doing. And that will probably go to, we'll do SEPA, we'll do notice, and bring it forward for a public hearing at the first opportunity.
Great.
Great.
Somebody have any other questions? All right. Well, our next meeting is October 20th, subdivision ordinance for anybody watching. So thank you guys very much. And with that, we'll adjourn.